enabling this for the community as we work together to think more about how to bring new stuff to the community. So we're excited to participate in that, not only for things that we're doing, but kind of helping to find other things that the community will be interested in looking at. This is great. We're super excited to bring this to the CFO Alliance first for a couple reasons. One, because we really value the community, and thank you all for participating. We want this to be a sounding board for you as we sort of show you sort of our experimentation over the last number of months. But there's a quid pro quo to that because we're looking to be a sounding board, to have you as a sounding board because we're actually trying to figure out what we should do with this. So I'm going to try and breeze through it and not get too into the weeds, but I think there'll be plenty of opportunity for Q&A. The more dialogue that we can catalyze in this discussion, the better. I don't want to spend the entire time talking. So if we are able to sort of get some peer-to-peer input and feedback and Q&A going, that would be ideal. And then we'll try to finish up. We'll try to finish up with sort of some feedback from you in terms of what you think we should be doing with this sort of in our next steps. And as we think about this as part of our FP&A solutions and overall roadmap. There are sort of two, I have a couple slides. One which will sort of anchor it, and another one which is sort of the detailed process that we've gone through. And I'll also show you an example of the sort of output that's been created through this process. So, we have listened to clients and the community and sort of looked to isolate what we think are sort of the biggest pain points in AI enablement in FP&A. And just to sort of run through them quickly, to us, these each sort of serve as these binary gates as organizations sort of think through and start to execute on AI enablement. And as you get to like each gate, if you fail that gate, it blows up the whole thing. So we've sort of tried to anchor in, what do we have to solve for just to turn the switch on? And from an FP&A perspective, that really starts with the fact that most FP&A is not based on real-time source data. We're putting together monthly business reviews. We're putting together board decks. These things are based on snapshots of data, not necessarily real-time connectivity into source systems. So this idea around sort of data discipline, centralization, single source of truth, where what's flowing through the dashboard and what's flowing through your board deck and what the AI is helping you to do is all aligned across the board. One of the big things we've seen in terms of playing with the different LLMs, not great at math. You ask the same question a few times and you can get a couple different answers. And unfortunately, in finance, that doesn't really work. Maybe it's okay if I'm generating marketing content, but if I'm doing variance analysis or I'm doing price volume mix analysis, I kind of need accuracy every time. And then another one of the big ones that we've seen in our work, especially with private equity-backed companies, is that the source data is not presented in the same way that we present our output data. So whether that's overlay mappings and EBITDA adjustments or allocation frameworks that sort of sit outside of our source systems, none of this is really that useful if it doesn't actually line up with the way that everybody in your organization is looking at your data. One of my favorites here, you ask AI a question. I think we have a new acronym which we're using, which is NSS, stands for No Shit Sherlock. Forgive the French, but if I put a bunch of data in this just the example I like to use is if I'm implementing a discounting strategy to go after market share and I put data in AI and it tells me, hey, I see that your price per unit is dropping. Do you know that's bad for business? Where it's like it's actually my strategy. So I'm more interested as to whether that's actually working for what I'm trying to do. We have concerns with confidential information going into the large language models. So the idea of data anonymization, encryption, hashing is something that different organizations need to deal with. And nobody likes a black box. So putting information in and having things come out and not understanding sort of what's happening in the process. Where there's been a lot of talk about AI-enabled forecasting. No CFO is going to go into the boardroom to present their budget and show a revenue build and then be questioned on how they did it and have them say like, well, I just put it into the AI and this is what it came out with. So we have to solve for each step of the process and being able to access the data and drill down deeper into it. And then lastly, nobody wants more software, not just because of the complexity around it, and the change management and the assessment, selection, and implementation process. But when we buy software platforms, we're committing to an environment. We're committing to a data environment. We're committing to a feature roadmap. And the more that we can do on our own and sort of take ownership and control into our own hands, the better we are. It's also going to be a lot cheaper than buying software if we can do it ourselves. So that's really sort of what we anchored in as sort of the pain points that CFOs have to deal with all things AI and FP&A. And so where we're now taking that is sort of defining our North Star. And our North Star of using AI and FP&A is we want to take the monthly business review and we want to push it along the spectrum to the real-time business review. So the classic MBR, especially if you work with some of our companies, and we've worked on about 100 of these, 50-page deck, 25th at the 25th day after the month. And it's really like, what can I do with this from an action perspective? It feels like more of a compliance initiative, like, oh, we got the MBR done. And so now we're saying, okay, we probably don't need a 50-page deck. Ideally, we have 6 pages on sort of the core things that everybody wants to see every month, and then we have 6 pages on what actually matters. And so if we can sort of move that culturally away from sort of the static, shallow, and stale view, then we're making a lot of progress in terms of making those business reviews more timely and more actionable. And so the sort of things that we're focused on is we want it to be dynamic, contextual. We want it to go deeper from an analysis perspective, and we want it all done faster. And so that's sort of how everything that we're thinking about for AI from an FP&A perspective, like everything we do is fully geared toward that. So where we're starting is gross margin analysis. And there are a couple of reasons why we chose that specifically. One, we've probably worked on 100 MBRs. Gross margin analysis and attribution, far and away the biggest gap that we see. We're not seeing detailed gross margin analysis the way that we think that organizations should be focused on it. Second, there's algebra involved in price volume mix analysis. So we wanted to pick something where we had to tackle the AI math problem. And it's also something that we've seen from an ERP or source system perspective doesn't really do a good job, or it's not enabled because you have information going from different sources. Your volume data might be over here and your accounting data might be over here. And lastly, we chose this because we know that from a gross margin perspective in revenue and COGS, that these items tend to close more quickly after the end of the month. And that if we focus in on this, we can now sort of compress the timeline faster. We go from, the 20th of the month to the 2nd of the month, and then we're pushing our way to sort of get to the point where we're doing this sort of flashing within the month so that maybe that there's the opportunity to actually take actions and have discussions that we can sort of change what's happening before the end of the month. So this is, again, all aligned with that North Star of sort of pushing that sort of stale monthly business review up from a timeline perspective. And so one of the things that we wanted to focus on was new stuff is great. Like being able to attach, an MCP server and use an LLM to ask your ERP questions has a ton of applications. Like that's great, but it doesn't really impact the core FP&A outputs and deliverables that we're still required to produce and that the demands are only going up on. Everybody wants, especially because you have AI, everybody wants more information. They want it faster. And so this is one way that we said, okay, like we need to focus on where the acceleration actually has impact. And that's not necessarily in new aspects of FP&A. It's in putting leverage and depth into core FP&A. And so with regards to the math and sort of the analysis that's being done, we want to make clear that these are all things that finance teams are capable of. Finance teams are capable of pivoting across dimensions and looking at trends. And these are sort of core competencies. But the problem is we don't have any time and we don't have enough resources. So if we want to look across every product, every customer, every time period, everything that's happening within those things, it just can't, it's something that can't be accomplished with the horsepower that we have. These are things that if you wanted to look through, every single thing, every single time, you could spend days or even weeks doing it. And using AI to support some of those things can change that to minutes. So this is the sort of what we call pivot everything. The other thing is we're trying to separate signal from noise, right? You see a variance in a period, and you say, okay, I see that variance. Well, does that customer have a trend across a longer time period? Is it the same across other customers? Are there things going on within a product suite that we need to be focused on? And so we're using the reasoning within the LLMs to say, hey, what actually matters here? So before I actually sort of show you some of the output, I want to sort of walk you through the full-blown process that we've put in place, just to sort of give you the end-to-end view. So, just starting from the top left here, you have your source data wherever it lives. And alongside that, you have what we would call data prep modules. So this is all the mapping, overlay mechanics, adjustment tables, things that essentially need to be smashed against that source data to get it into the form that you're going to use for whatever output and presentation view that you're doing. We worship at the Microsoft altar. So we use Microsoft OneLake as our sort of primary data repository. So we're getting that all into OneLake as sort of everything that we're going to pull from is now going to be living in that single repository. So all the data transformation, all of that happening in the cloud, and it sort of gets all the data ready for everything that's going to deal with this. The next step of this process, we're using Python, and this is really to address the math problem with regard to the LLMs. So we're actually doing all the math, and we're using code to do all the math. So we're doing all of the detailed price volume mix analysis that gets to all of the individual components, and that's going to be the foundation for what we're going to present to AI. We're not asking AI to do any of the actual math in this regard. So this is something that what some people might refer to as curated data pipelines. We think that this is a core capability for being able to use AI in finance is you actually have to knock the math out first. The next step of this is what we call the conversation flow manager. And so if there's IP in this whole thing, it's in that conversation flow manager because those are the step-by-step instructions that we've developed with a team, with an FP&A team as to how we want this gross margin analysis to go step by step. Go look at this first, then this. Go fetch this data. See if you need more data. And so this is where sort of the FP&A expertise comes into play, to sort of guide the process. It's also what enables us to have consistency of output. So we don't want a different looking report if we're going to run this thing multiple times a month. We want it to look the same way. We want the process to be the same, even if the things that are found are very, very different. So we found it's a lot easier to have sort of a standard view of what's going to come out. Even if the information is different, it just makes it that much easier and faster for CFOs and teams to sort of digest and then take the next step. This is also a place where we're providing all the critical context, business context, initiative context, strategic context, because the one way that we're going to avoid that NSS type output is to provide the necessary context on sort of what we already know and what we expect so that the analysis that is deployed is something that's going to give us some feedback against those things. So if I say, hey, I'm going to go with a discount strategy to try and capture market share, I don't need the AI to tell me that my price per unit is dropping. I need to know whether my initiative is working. So what we are doing both for historical data and in this case forecast data as well is we're trying to take all of the data but also all of the context. And so it's easy to see how this can advance over time, especially with agentic applications. Imagine being in a location-based business and mid-month you're able to incorporate the qualitative feedback of all of your location managers to have that smash against the data to know whether actually anything needs to be done. If you know that you're pacing weak, but your location manager says this is just a timing issue, we're good on our expectations for the month. I don't need a whole bunch of analysis around the variance of why I'm pacing short of plan. So we're trying to use context and instructions to cut the noise. The next step is the actual engagement with the LLM. And so this is where we are anonymizing data. So we're using randomized customer, product, vendor type names. We're pushing that into AI along with the prompts. And then we're getting certain outputs. And then we're actually de-anonymizing the data so that the outputs that get our real back information in. The output I'll show you here still has that anonymization, which is just something that we did for confidentiality purposes because we're using real company data for this. The next step is the actual generation of the report, which again, we're using Python just to actually populate what the report's going to look like. And then lastly is distribution. You want to email it, you want to send it somewhere, you want to text it to somebody, you can do whatever you want. So before I actually show the output of this, I just wanted to pause, especially because I haven't monitored any chat here. If there are any questions or sort of thoughts there from the group before we actually look at sort of what this is. I'll give you a second. Everybody's on mute, but I'll throw it out there. Meanwhile, I'll pull it up.
So Ben, you're using Python for some actual calculations. You mentioned earlier that you're kind of pivoting out of, given the complexity of some calculations for the KPIs that most CFO, finance executives, companies look at. But later down the line for report generation, you're using Python to integrate the output.
Yeah, so we're using Python to actually create the report. So the actual format of the output, this is just a web file that you see up on the screen. This was actually created through a Python script so that we had sort of that same consistent format each time.
Got it.
And again, the goal of this for us is that we don't want this to be sort of an isolated output. We want this to be something that's used side by side with existing outputs. So whether that's MD&A for your MBR deck, or context alongside a dashboard, the goal of sort of creating some of these outputs is to sort of make a lot of the other core FP&A processes easier and faster. One of the things I didn't touch on the process slide was there was a little yellow asterisk in a couple areas. And so one of the things we've also done is we're creating full audit logs of all the data that is created in this process. So everything that Python's doing, all the price volume mix calculations, all of that gets dumped into an audit log. So we're trying to solve for the black box of, well, now I want to go deeper, but I didn't do that math myself. So how am I going to do that? So we're spitting out all of the data that's created to give people maximum flexibility to be able to sort of go dive where they want to go dive.
Got it.
So I'm going to I'll breeze through this to show you sort of the different kind of buckets that we identified and included in this. This is a real company's information. It's from a home products distribution company, and the reason we chose them is because there's thousands of SKUs, and they're having a lot of tariff fun. So they source from 13 different countries. So we've got historical data at a SKU level. We've actually got a forecast at a SKU level as well. And so we thought that this would be a good example for sort of a like richness and depth of analysis that can be enabled when you have that level of granularity at your fingertips. But that also creates a challenge for teams because it's hard to go look at 6,000 SKUs at an individual SKU level, every month or 2 weeks or whenever you want to do this. Uh, so I'm just going to scroll through this and talk, and if anybody wants to stop and ask questions, feel free to interrupt me and chime in. But the real purpose of this, I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of what this sort of AI enablement brings out and sort of the different sort of dialogues that could be spurred from it. So we start with sort of traditional bridges. Again, this is something that we don't see that much out of source systems. They tend to not do a great job of sort of creating these sort of attribution analyses on their own. Teams are usually dumping things out into Excel and building waterfall charts and things like that. So we did want to start there. And then we go through sort of what you would see as, the traditional things you would want to look at. Top customer impacts, top product impacts, just to sort of give that sense of like, hey, what are the top drivers of what's going on? And then we really get into sort of what's different each time. So with our conversation flow manager, we're trying to prioritize and provide kind of materiality scoring to things that are moving the needle. So we're identifying, high, medium, low type severity, and this is sort of the starting point of like where you would get triggered to then go kind of dive in deeper. Um, and so we're looking at, hey, what is going on in the forecast versus the historical, what's going on in, the last quarter versus current quarter. This analysis just for the group is done on a quarterly basis just because it fits better for this business. So anything you see that where it's quarterly could just as easily be monthly. It's very flexible and as long as you sort of control for the time periods of the data that you're working with. We then got trend analysis in terms of what is driving change across the different time periods, and then we start getting into sort of assessment. So we're providing context around, hey, we have these goals. These are the things we're working toward. In this case, we're focused on being able to pass through pricing because of tariffs, but we also know that a dollar pass through for a dollar of cost increase is dilutive from a margin percentage basis, even if we preserve dollar margin. And so we're sitting here saying like, hey, success is getting it passed through. If we maintain margin dollars, we're probably doing well here, even if our gross margin percentage declines. So we're trying to wrestle with the fact that percentage views versus dollar views can tell very different stories. And then, probably my favorite part of this analysis is being able to use the data in your actuals to provide a feasibility analysis against your forecast or forward budget or whatever you're looking at in the outlook. We're trying to say, hey, what are the elements in our forecast and the assumptions that we've made versus everything that we found, and give me context on whether my forecast is it pessimistic from a viability perspective or optimistic. In this case, pessimistic actually means conservative. So we're saying, hey, you might be too conservative in your forecast assumptions based on what the historical data is actually telling us. And so across price, volume, and mix, it goes through and says, hey, here's what I see in your forecast. Here's what the trends are telling me. Let's go look at this. Maybe you're being too conservative or too aggressive here. And so that's probably, I think, the most valuable part of this in terms of the go forward view. And then we've got anomaly detection, big spikes and changes, lumpiness, things to dig into, as well as sort of qualitative summaries on sort of the largest impact findings, and then sort of recommended deep dives. So it's like, hey, this product is exhibiting a strange behavior. let's go look at that. This customer is doing something that the trend is weird, like it's worth going and talking and figuring out what's going on there. And so it will actually suggest the areas to go dive deeper without you having to sort of scan all the numbers and figure it out for yourself. Um, this has is that this version, which is sort of our internal version, has a full download of everything we go through in the process from a conversation and AI output perspective. So we can actually go in here and we can see the entirety of the prompts that are being used in the process, as well as what Claude is spitting back out to us. And so you can see here in this process, we're going through like 6 different iterative engagements with the AI to do all of this. And so that's something where we say, okay, this iteration, it identifies more data that it needs to go get. It goes back into our data frames, grabs that data, and then it runs it through again, and it just builds on itself. And then, of course, we've got kind of appendices on just other data views, anomalies, and things that we might want to dig in on. So that was the super fast walkthrough of what the output is created in sort of the report format that sort of comes out of this. As I switch back to the deck, love to hear any sort of thoughts or comments or questions that you have about sort of the approach or why we did what we did.
Yeah, Ben, I have a quick question to jump in there. So when you looked at the results, if I'm understanding this correctly, Claude kind of gave you the highlights or the analysis that you or I or Nick or whoever on the team would normally be doing, or the FP&A team, and then drawing out some conclusions. And it sounds like A, some conclusions weren't fully vetted because we needed more information. That's a yes.
In some instances, because we're controlling which data goes in, if Claude via the prompt identifies where it could go deeper, it will go fetch that incremental data. So we're not just throwing all the data in, it's happening in sort of a stepstone fashion.
Okay, and then with that, since you're controlling the data that goes in for analysis, did you come across any instances where possibly a metric or conclusion was not accurate? In other words, if I don't know, I'll just give a simple example. This is probably not true, but if margins were compressing over time, that Claude, your agent, gave back a review that said, "Oh, margins are increasing over time. This is a good thing." Did you find anything like that?
It's interesting because most of those types of items, because they weren't math problems, because the math is static, had to do with sort of the step in which those calculations were done. So if we were looking at quarterly totals, and then the data was actually monthly, and then we would find like this friction that happened between like, oh, well, that was calculated on a quarterly basis, and then if you go into the months with some of the math, like you would get some conflicting information. And so those were the types of things that in our development process we iterated on to fix and understand. And it actually resulted in sort of us changing things that we were doing in the math setup in order to make sure that that didn't happen.
So if you started off on your analysis, let's say monthly, and then maybe later on down the line you want to pivot to quarterly or last 6 months or something like that, you can change that orientation on what you're analyzing, and then that flows through the entire view of the metrics that you're looking at. In other words, you don't have to go to each attribute and say, "Oh, wait, this one was month over month. I wanted quarter over quarter." It's like you start quarter over quarter, it flows through in the rest of the analysis. Is that sound about right?
Yeah, and I would say that the sort of control over the periodicity in your data is very important for this. So being able to control for, hey, if I'm calculating certain things on a quarterly basis, if I were to do that same thing on a monthly basis by itself, I could get sort of different outputs. Those are critical items that need to be controlled for in this process for sure.
Awesome. I love this. This is great.
Let me go back to the deck here.
Hey Ben.
Yep.
So is it true that, do I understand it right, that the data universe from which it's going to pull is what you've defined in that top right box, calculation and data frames, and that whatever you put in or don't put in, that is the source and the end all, and it won't hallucinate for things that aren't there. It'll come back and say, this is just what I can do. Do I have that right?
That's correct. So we're seeking complete control over the data and calculation side of this.
Okay. And then does it, how do you marry up financial data that's not well synchronized with the GL?
Can you expand on that a little
I'm
bit?
sorry, operational data that's not, that maybe crosses multiple GLs. Is that something that you've already brought in? You've already figured out either by process, in that calculations and data frames?
Yeah, so I guess one way to rephrase that a little bit is if you've got certain information that is grouped up, right? Like your operational data might have product level information, but your ledger data maybe I'm not sure why this would be the case, but your ledger data might be at like a product group level. And so you've got like this mix of granularity where like this data doesn't align directly with this data. Those are things that we would want to identify in terms of like our knowledge of the data, and we would provide that as context to the AI to say, hey, you're not going to be able to go compare these things apple to apples, but within the data frames, we can sort of work on the aggregation to make those things more aligned so that they are directly comparable.
Okay, that makes sense. It's
And
a,
that might be something that we actually deal with on the source data side with those data prep modules, where we need to get additional mapping into the data before it feeds into the data frames, just to ensure that that's the case. So you still need significant care and process around the data prep in order to avoid some of the things that you and Kenny have brought up in terms of what will happen with the AI output if you don't control for those things.
makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you have
got
the chat and you have Samit. Okay, so why don't you go with Samit and then would you read the chat, Ben? But Samit has a question.
Let's see if I can
yeah.
get it here.
Can you, hi guys. A good presentation, Ben. The question I have is more around like, is this a product or is it a service? I mean, when I think about everything you have in the first few buckets, source data, data prep modules, you're building that repository. That to me is like a lot of like heavy lifting, data cleanup, understanding the business. So like you're building a custom solution for whoever the client is in this case before you can really do everything else at the bottom side.
Well, that's a great segue into the discussion on like what we should do with this. So,
Mm.
I think you are right. Now we have in our FP&A BPO business, we have sort of a standardized approach to data architecture that we sort of fit companies into with their data. So we have like set hierarchies and dimensions and tags that we create with regard to those data prep modules so we can sort of build consistency in terms of what the underlying architecture is going to look like. And like that actual step is can be a fair amount of work, but it's not an obscene amount of work, especially if we're working off of a standardized approach. The challenge around it all is like it's easy when we own the entirety of the FP&A function because everything that we're doing in FP&A runs off that central source of truth repository. The problem with creating a central source of truth repository, if it's not used across your processes, is that not everything's connected to the central source of truth. So this does work best when it's within the entirety of the FP&A ecosystem and everything you're doing in reporting and BI and budgeting and forecasting is all tied into that same repository.
But it's more than that, right? I mean, it's all your CRMs and your operations and your unit economies and like things that may not be in your FP&A system or the GL system.
That's
So
right.
it
So
needs to
when we
be,
say source data, we're saying from all the respective systems. So we're bringing that in. So whether it's the unit data is separate from the accounting data, we're marrying all that information together in that repository from whatever the systems are. Just because we have companies that are on multiple ERPs or multiple instances of QuickBooks, and so we have that sort of unified architecture that sits on top of that to sort of bring it all into a singular format and architecture.
thanks.
But you're right, it is a lot easier if we've already done that. So
Ben, do you have access
I
to
wanted
the
to spend
chat?
a couple. Sorry, go
Do you
ahead.
have do you have access to the chat, Ben? Can you see Ode's
Let's
questions?
see. So I say, how are the recommended deep dives or further analysis fed back into the system to avoid seeing the same recommendations the next time? One, when if you're doing it sort of multiple times per month, you can update the context. So if you saw something or you know something, the context can be updated for the next run. But overall, if you're thinking about like doing this on a monthly cadence, you kind of do want to go through the same process because you want to see what's different. So the process allows for enough variability to sort of score things from a materiality perspective to unearth what matters, but the process itself that we're going through is the same, right? Like those instructions, like those core instructions and the process that we're stepping through here are the same every time you do this. So you may see something that say like, okay, like I know I have that volume issue. Like, could you just not talk to me about my volume issue because I'm well aware of that one? You would update the context and you would instruct the AI in its analysis to say, I don't want to, I know this is there. I don't want you to focus on this. I don't want you to treat this as material. I want you to ignore it. And so that's how you would manage that. Let me see what else is here.
Actually, thank you for this. It relates to my second question is practically the how is the context brought into the system? Very practically, that's done through documents you upload or prompts that you write. How does that work?
Right now, they're fed in directly. The sort of future roadmap of this could involve like a UX skin where kind of the active context lives somewhere and you can go and sort of update it. And then you could then go to sort of the way that the roadmap can advance on this is that you could be setting up, RAG and looking at unstructured documents, and you could actually be using AI to help define your context based on a series of documents or data or other things that you would feed into it. So it's not hard to see from this foundation how it can kind of get exponentially more powerful as those additional capabilities are enabled.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of been my major focus and concern. I've been looking at tools since the FA conference a couple weeks ago, and what I'm kind of learning is to make it as good as it can be, you need to align the qualitative information with some sort of time-bound structure. So my organization has a challenge because we manage all of our projects based on an academic school year, but our fiscal year is a calendar year. And so we're reporting regularly on our fiscal year, but our projects change and costs shift and revenues recognized differently. And there's a lot of quarter over quarter reporting that we need to do. And what I'm struggling with is how exactly what your question was about some of the qualitative information is can we just dump data, right? Can we dump a contract and then meeting notes and just trust that the system's going to pick up on it? It's maybe I think is the answer. And this is not just your solution, Ben. I think this is across the
Mhm.
board AI in general. But if you can find a way, and I actually just started up a prompt in Copilot today to try to figure out a good structure to do this. If you figure out a way to kind of include those contextual inputs, but kind of have them time bound, and then give the engine that to work with, I think it makes it much better, especially when you're comparing quarter over quarter or month over month or year over year. And I think, I don't know, and Ben, maybe that's too large of a question, but is that something that you've considered, or do you think that this tool's better with that kind of the time-bound context, or are you kind of getting to a point where you can take that unstructured data and do something with it?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of first step of many, right? So we think about it in sort of a hub and spoke type way, right? So that the by owning every step of the process, especially in that sort of conversation flow manager box, that gives us the flexibility to sort of further develop like how data is utilized within the process. So there can be a separate repository of unstructured data, and within that conversation flow manager, we'll say, go review that. It would be a different separate capability, right, to get all that unstructured data into a way that it can be reviewed and analyzed from an AI's perspective. But we see that as an opportunity to refine context, but also to kind of go deeper from an analysis perspective. So, there's all sorts of really cool things that are on the sort of roadmap stepping stones here. I mean, imagine an agentic approach by, whatever is found in this analysis will automatically email the owner of that specific component, get a response from them, and immediately incorporate that response contextually back into the analysis for the next run or a rerun. And so again, like that idea of the location-based business, if you had 10 locations and you grow to 50, I think our goal with AI enablement is like, I'm going to run that with the exact same finance team. And that's not going to work if I've got to get somebody on the phone with all 50 location managers. So there's all sorts of potential streamlining in terms of access to data and information and sort of actual engagement with the organization that some of these AI capabilities will enable. We are not, Barry, we are not to the place where we're ready to like turn on, the email agent to go get the information from the respective person and then actually incorporate the response automatically back into the context. But that's kind of where we're going.
But that assumes that whoever's using this has um uh their security teams is okay with that, right? Like there's some companies that refuse to connect anything to anything because it could potentially be an information security breach or something like that.
Yeah, and so that data anonymization, which is an optional component of that, that can start to break down when you start including a bunch of unstructured data, right? So if you've got Microsoft that you're creating as like customer AB underscore 23, and over here you've got a contract that says Microsoft Corporation in it. That's where you start getting a little tricky in sort of managing the anonymization. But that's something that as we work through how these processes are going to work within our organizations that we have to figure out, right? Like where is it okay for this specific data or this type of data to cross the Rubicon into the LLMs and whatnot. And we should all be very, very mindful of that. I've talked to a couple people, one of which is developing private language models, the small language model for government entities. And he was telling me that anonymization is actually better than encryption because encryption leaves a trace that can be cracked. And that when you're actually typing in the box of the LLMs and not hitting submit, those types are still being logged. So, there's things that I think we don't know and appreciate. And I think we recognize that this is something that people have to sort of crawl, walk, run as it relates to the data utilization for AI and sort of clear all those gates over time.
Ben, would you check the chat again, please? There's another question.
Data privacy and protecting proprietary data other than the manual data cleanups. Can the AI be hosted on a private server? I mean, I think that's where we're all heading, right? I mean, we're starting to talk about whether we create and train and host, our own small language model at First Water, the quote unquote like First Water FP&A brain. And that's something that we are experimenting with, and we think is, a couple years from now we're going to be dealing with sort of out of the box small language models that we're all going to be sort of training with our own data. And we'll just have to be able to manage the maintenance and hosting of that as opposed to something that's done in the cloud. So I'd love to spend a couple minutes just to get some
He did
feedback
have
from
one
the
more,
group.
Ben, he did have one more follow on. If you see that, did you
Oh, I'm
see?
sorry. I have a little tiny screen I'm looking at up here.
Yeah, little follow on right after it. Can they be run continuously running? You see that?
This is something that could be run as long as you're okay with your token cost and whatnot, as often as you're getting the updated data into that repository. So technically, if you're sort of using a data integration tool and you're mirroring data in daily, you could trigger this daily. So because we're not real time connected, into the underlying source systems. We can't say that it's like always on or always running because of that aspect of sort of controlling the snapshot of the data that we're working with so that the output is sort of aligned with other things we're doing in FP&A. I think those are future capabilities, but in terms of sort of focusing in on like the core deliverables that we have to create, that, this is where we've started. But, these are things that from a cost perspective, in terms of running them, it gets cheaper all the time. And then it gets back down to how quickly you're able to bring the data you need in to be able to run this. But this is something that runs start to finish sort of in less than 10 minutes. So I see a couple other things that Greg's posting in there, but I think I got all the questions, Nick, but let me know if I missed anything. I wanted to spend a few minutes just kind of collecting some feedback from the group on sort of how we're thinking about this. So Sumit brought up a good point that, hey, if that data foundation and that centralization doesn't exist within an organization, you've got to figure that out. And that's something that we do as part of our FP&A process and capability development in companies. And so, yes, when we control the ecosystem, it is easier and faster. But there are ways to do it quickly, especially to enable this specific process, and then understand how it's coordinated with what the rest of the organization is doing. I don't think it's a huge step to say, hey, the version of the general ledger that we're going to use for that output, like it's that one and it lives there. But that's something from a process discipline perspective that we all have to control for in anything related to FP&A. So the way that we're sort of starting to think about this is we're trying to understand whether this is something that we do on a custom one-off basis, whether it's something we template out more like a product, or it's just something we don't sell and we just sort of keep as part of our own FP&A capabilities that just make us a lot better at what we do. One of the ideas that was presented to us, sort of as an option to fund development, was to create a pilot partner program where we would bring in a group of CFOs and companies to sort of write our roadmap and say, hey, as we continue to develop and improve this, like everybody sort of gets the benefit of that. It's not necessarily fully customized for every individual company or environment, although that's something that we absolutely could do. But it creates this dialogue of the sounding board in terms of like, where should this be deployed in my organization? What are the other areas where I think that I would get a lot of leverage and success out of, AI support and enablement within FP&A? So we don't think about this only as gross margin analysis or P&L analysis. We think about this as the backdrop for a much bigger conversation over our data maturity, FP&A capability, and AI enablement roadmaps. And so we see it as having a lot of value in sort of spurring that dialogue within organizations. So as we think about sort of the right way to fund additional development on this, one of the ideas that we had was, hey, let's bring in a select group who's going to, lean in on it. When by lean in, I mean have a conversation once a month or so, not only with us, but potentially among the other pilot partner peers, so that we all sort of accelerate and sort of inform where we go next. So if we have a group of CFOs that say, this is really what's important to me, chances are that's the next place we would go in development. But this is sort of an idea that we had sort of, almost in like that pre-commercialization step, that we would give a select group an outlet and sort of access to it before we sort of, as we continue to develop and fine tune it and decide sort of exactly what we want to do about that. And sort of the key benefits around something like that is if we got the data, we don't need any involvement from the team. There's no big implementation costs because we're plugging you into the process and framework that we've already built. And I do think that there's going to be a big knowledge share benefit of having a group involved in this that sort of comes together periodically and sort of informs the roadmap. But if you tell me I should just go sell it, like maybe I should just go sell it.
Well, for those of us that are continuing looking for either seated positions or fractional positions, do you have any recurring meetings that present the and discuss the evolution of your software. I mean, I think this is awesome, and I'm sure there's going to be iterative changes that this just explodes and improves, and everybody jumps in. Can I get this? Can I get that? That kind
Yeah.
of thing.
So, Kenny, what was the question there? Is
Oh,
there a recurring? So this is the first one, right? So this is the very first look at this, and so we haven't even thought through kind of how we would want to engage in sort of a recurring cadence on the progress of this. If we pull a group into this paid pilot partner program, like obviously that would do there, but I think we are ready and willing within the CFO Alliance community to bring updates back to the community and solicit additional feedback and input from the community. And it's one of the greatest assets we think of our involvement within the community is being able to do that.
yeah, I agree, and I think you call out what Nick and you and Greg have been speaking about, along with the broader team, about all the the noise about implement AI. Sponsors are all over your back, and it's like, well, you really need to understand, what do you mean by that? Like
Yeah.
implementing AI, and the thing that caught my attention when you initially did the presentation and showing your grid is like, well, let's talk about what data we're talking about, and then controlling the data, and then what are you trying to get out of that information? You just don't, like, in the last 5 6 years, it's all been Power BI, and you just kind of merge everything together, and everybody's like, great, what is that? Is that real time, or is that accounting data? Is it adjusted for whatever reserves and things like that? And it sounds like you're thinking that through very methodically, which I truly believe is the foundation before you can start to launch a tool like this or anything else that finance leaders are working with.
Yeah, Kenny, I think that's one of the biggest difference between these processes and solutions being developed by finance people versus technology people. If
Mhm.
you just see sort of what is being advanced on the technology side, it's real-time everything. But if 90% of what I do is not based on real-time data, like those solutions aren't for me. And so I think that's one of the primary benefits of sort of this capability development being in the hands of a finance team. And there are technical capabilities. You have to be able to work with code and things like that. But as we sort of think about like our team construction and our capability and resource access, this gets back to like, hey, do I need somebody on my finance team that can work with Python? I mean, it's a legitimate open question that is going to become more prominent as organizations figure out how am I going to attack this in a way that I control it and own it and like I get what I actually need out of it versus some templated thing that, is just coming out of my software environment.
Hey,
Yep,
Ben, you've
I
got just
agree.
2 minutes. I think Barry may have a question. His hand's up.
Yeah,
Okay, hey Barry.
yeah. It's more of an observation, and then I guess just kind of answering your question. So, um, the last couple of weeks, like I said, I'm talking with vendors. I think that compared to who's doing something very similar to what you're trying to do, you're pretty far along compared to people who are actually selling product. Which I don't want to say it's good or bad one way or the other, but I think some other organizations are starting to sell a product that may be premature. It's not, it's still half baked in a way. Um, Second observation is there's there's a spectrum of these FP&A tools and what they're doing specifically around AI. You've got, the platforms that are already doing this type of thing, like the Adaptives of the world and the data rails, who are just adding AI features on top, but they're still trying to sell the platform. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's something that sits on top of a platform, which sounds like it's more of what you're doing. You're incorporating data, but you're not trying to sell a platform. And then there's kind of some stuff in between. Again, going back to, I think you're pretty far along here, so you could technically go out and start selling this tomorrow, but is that short-sighted to trying to, polish you know the uh, the tool, whatever you want to call it, and try to polish it and perfect it and get some feedback from finance professionals. I mean, I'm from a selfish perspective, I want to be part of this pilot, so I think you should pilot it. But I also don't think that waiting a couple months to try to get some input from the finance community is going to really be much of a negative. So, and I do think, creating a little bit of a vibe and some energy within our CFO Alliance group would probably do some great things for whatever you end up deciding to do.
Thank you, Barry. I mean, that's great feedback, and I appreciate that. The I'm not going to respond on the half-baked products going to market because I think that there's a long trail of destruction around marketing promises versus value reality. But where we see this and why we think it stays separate from sort of a traditional product or technology company is like we are staying true to forcing this alongside the rest of what you're doing in FP&A. So we're not looking for a platform that's doing one thing and then we're putting AI on top of that. We're focusing in on the entirety of the FP&A function and how this sits within everything else that's already being done within that function, which actually, that's the tug of war for us, is because that doesn't lend itself to sort of being sold like a traditional technology or software product. We're roadmap architects and sort of solution execution people, right? We're not a software company. And so, that's something that I think kind of keeps it. We're not worried about somebody else beating us to the market because like we're designing this for the things that we do every day and that we do alongside and collaborate with our companies every day. And we think that these are core capabilities that organizations are going to need to be able to either hire for or be able to tap on an outsourced basis, and not something that they should reach for software specifically on because of the other limitations on flexibility that software represents. If you buy an FP&A software platform, you're committing to a data repository on top. That can be totally fine if that platform is going to become your anchor for things that you're doing in FP&A. But the minute you do something outside of that, if you don't have a SQL access endpoint into that platform's repository, you've now blown up the entire idea of a central source of truth repository. And that's one of the big challenges that we say, like, oh, I have this platform with this data and this platform with this data, but I don't have complete control and flexibility over how I access and control it.
Well, Ben, thank you. And thank everybody here for, first off, Ben, thank you for the candor and the effort and the investment you've made, and also for the option to go deeper. Thank you, CFO Alliance members, for the time, energy, effort, the attention, and the thoughtfulness in the questions posed. Digest this. Sarah Henderson, Ben Lehrer's partner and head of relationships and development here and the liaison to the CFO Alliance community, will make sure that she provides access to this deck. Ponder the thought of being part of this pilot partner program, open to questions that I'm sure, and Ben is readily available and accessible and visible in this community 24/7. So happy holidays, everyone. Digest this. More importantly, Ben, I hope you're pleased with the input and feedback you've gotten in the immediacy of this, and you take it back with you too, okay?
Absolutely.
Thank
I
you, everybody.
appreciate everybody's taking the time to invest in participating in this and thinking through it. Please feel free to reach out directly to me, any sort of Q&A. We'd love to engage and figure out how we accelerate this.